Hello everyone, Gabe here from the Uplay team, and I am joined again by the person who knows basically everything. How are you today, sir?
I'm very good today. How are you?
I'm doing all right. What are we doing today?
Today we're going to look at processor speed, or in a way, processor speed. You'll see more in the video itself.
Well, I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Let's have fun.
So where does this mind-melting experience start?
So as we talked about last time, we load the RAM. So when we create a program, it is in RAM. We load it into RAM, and a program is just a set of instructions. And then we execute the instructions, and then we run the data. That was kind of the thing we found out last time. So we need to fetch the instructions. We need to decode the instructions. So is it going to be an add? We want to add two numbers together, or is it's from the first episode, like what path are we going to take in our ALU? Then we execute, we send it through the ALU. And a part of that also is we then need to access the memory. What is the data that we actually need to access? Is it in RAM? Is it in any of the L1, L2, L3 caches? Or is the memory already in one of the registers? Like we saw in the last episode, we had 4 registers, A, B, C, and D. And then when that has executed, we have gotten the memory and we have added together the numbers, we write it back to wherever we want it to be. A register, the cache, the RAM, or all of the above. We can do that. So this is what's called the instruction cycle. This is what the CPU is doing, and one of these boxes is one cycle in the CPU.
So one cycle is fetching, one cycle is decoding, one cycle is execution.
Exactly. So to do one thing on the CPU, you have to do 5 cycles.
Sounds like it's going to take a while.
Yeah, so if you are running a 5 hertz CPU, it will take you 1 second to do this.
But we don't run 5 hertz CPUs.
We absolutely do not run 5 hertz CPUs.
Did we ever?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
A lot of older machines. One thing to note, this is a generalization. The actual thing that's happening, like I would have to put a lot of boxes into these boxes and etc. But for our point of view,
It was a code school reference.
Yeah,
Boxes
yeah.
inside boxes.
Boxes into boxes. This is enough for us to figure out what's going on. And this, a lot of the stuff that's going to happen in this episode is very abstract, but it should give you a general idea of what's going on. And if you want to learn more, then you can probably Google many of the ideas here and get much more smarter ideas. So let's take this cycle over here and rotate it. So let's say that we want to add the number 5 into A. So from last time, A is a register. It has some number in it. We don't know what the number is. We want to add 5 to it. And we have that cycle over here. And let's imagine that we have those 5 cycles, the clock speed of the CPU. So in the first one, we do the fetch. In the second one, we decode. In the third one, we execute. Then we do stuff with the memory, fetch it from wherever it is, and then we write it back. There's a thing here to note. These are separate systems in the CPU. Like there is some sort of fetching mechanism, some decoding mechanism, like we saw with in the first episode. The execution is the ALU. The memory, like you might have to go to RAM or whatever. So a lot of these in many CPUs is a separate thing. So when we are doing the decode in the second cycle, there's the fetch is being bored, right? The fetch part of the system isn't doing anything. And
just wasting like a whole cycle, just sitting around waiting for something to come in.
It's going to waste 4 cycles.
Yeah, in total, yeah.
Yeah. And the same thing for execution. It's waiting 2 cycles, and then it gets to do something, and then it's waiting 2 cycles again.
It's like watching a race. Just the cars come by at one point, and you're like, oh.
Yeah, you can celebrate for that 10th of a second, and then you just have to wait for everything else. And imagine even, what if the memory thing is going to RAM? Then you might have to wait way more than 2 cycles for it. And imagine then if we wanted to add 5 into A, And if we want to add whatever is in A into B, then that's another 5 cycles, and that's another line like this.
This seems really slow for just 2 adds.
It's very slow. Well, in modern CPUs, we're talking about nanoseconds, but it's still slow. And even if it was super fast, we are being wasteful. Like, it's 1 in 5 cycles we're doing something.
Yeah, there's a lot of downtime.
A lot of downtime. So what if we just did this? We would see that we're going to add 5 into A, then we want to add A into B. So we would fetch the instruction, we would load from RAM the add A5, and then in the second cycle, we would fetch from RAM add BA, but also decode add A5.
But don't we need to know what A is?
There we go.
Uh-oh.
Exactly the point. Yes, this is exactly the point. So there's a problem here. And the problem is when you are writing into memory the data from A, so you're adding 5 into A, and then we want to, when we want to write back. So it's the last one, the bottom column, the bottom gray one. We want to write whatever happened in A back into memory or RAM or whatever, but then at the same time, in the same cycle, the second to lowest orange cube is fetching from A. That might not be there yet.
Yeah.
So there's a problem here. And one thing you can do is you can just wait.
But that's wasted time.
Yeah. So if we would have a third one, we have it here. It's all good, just added the third one. So we can stack them up. But yeah, there's a problem here with when we add to B. So what you can do then is you can just shift them. You say, no, we saw this. This is called a hazard, usually called a hazard. And so we just shift things. But that also means that we're shifting the blue one. But if you notice in the blue one, it doesn't depend on anything.
Yeah.
It's independent.
So couldn't we just...
Again, yes, absolutely. So this is so this gap here is called a hazard. That we might collide is called a hazard, and the gap is called a bubble. So that's why we can put a bubble in here. This is a pretty simplistic example. Usually you would be absolutely packed of instructions, and you would try to pack them as much as you can. And you can think of that if we are like this, and it just keeps on going forever and ever, both ways, then you have a full utilization of your CPU. You're using every portion of it. You can think of that as 100% CPU.
Or really good optimization, maybe?
Yeah, but you would have to have an operating system or a compiler or a CPU that figures out that, hey, this is not going to work. This is a hazard. We need to move it, but that creates a bubble. And if you have a bubble, what happens with bubbles, like in this case, is that they propagate. So in this case, we're only moving the orange and the blue box. But can you imagine if you'd have a huge line that would also have other hazards in it? So you're stalling.
Just have a bunch of bubbles.
Bunch of bubbles. And in actual systems, it is full of bubbles. So what you can then also do is, since C is independent from A and B, you can just swap them. Because if you swap them, you do C first, because you found out that it is independent. It has nothing to do.
How did you find out that it's independent? Does a program just know that it's independent?
So there is a thing called data flow analysis that does this. They would look at every single instruction and create a graph. And if the graph is independent from other graphs,
how fast is it doing that? That sounds like a lot of work on its own.
Sometimes compilers do this, and they will reorder.
Okay. So it's like you program something, and then the compiler will go, okay, this should be slotted in here. Yes, actually. Okay.
They will reorder.
So this isn't something that's being actively done on the CPU constantly.
I don't know if they do that. I wouldn't be surprised if they could do that.
But it sounds like it would slow things down quite a bit.
Could be. And this is, of course, we're just doing adds in here. If you're doing branching, like an if statement, then that is an absolute bubble and a hazard, and then you need to, because you thought you were going to run something, it looked like you were running something, but no, you need to stop, go back and fetch something else, put that in and run that. And that's why they have like branch predictions of like, oh, I think it's likely that this is going to be true, this if this is going to be true, so let's just load all the stuff in, and if it's not true, we'll take the hit. So yeah, they will
take the damage.
Yeah, take the damage, because if it's 90% that it will hit, you get an immense speed up.
Yeah.
So you can just flip it. So if we back up, think of this box here, we can think of it as a CPU core. This is one core that's happening here. And you can then think of, we load it from memory, let's say memory address number 100 or 0x100. We're going to load that into A. This is some sort of, this is not actually assembly. You can think of this as an idea of some code. And then we want to add 1 to that number, whatever number was in 100. Then we want to store back into 100 whatever was in A. So we say, hey, RAM location, please come into this register. We're going to take whatever number is in there, make it higher by 1, and then we're going to say, go back to RAM. And on the way, it will also go back to all the caches and that stuff, because it might be likely that you want that number again. Because let's say that that number is the location of the player, or that number is your health, or whatever, that we are asking for that number again and again. So they will be put into the cache. So when next time we say load into A from address number 100,
it'll have it already.
It's going to be in one of the caches. So that's super nice. Then we can think of another instruction that loads from the same RAM address into B, increases it by 2, and then stores it back. And here you see that it's one application, one program that is accessing the same memory address. And that's also a hazard. That can be a problem, because
it'll kick A out.
Well, you need to do it in exactly, because if this is what the programmer did, he said like, okay, well, I want to load this number, I want to increase it by 1, and then I want to store it back. And then I want to load another number. I don't know why they put B, but let's just do that for an example. And then increase it by 2, and then put that back from B. You can't reorder this. So there will be a bubble here, because they're going to use the same memory address. But if you would swap B to load some other memory address, then what you can actually do is you can stack them. You can say, let's do the loads in the beginning. Let's do the adds then one after another, and then let's do the stores. You could do it like this, because they are independent of each other. So you can do the reordering, and you would have probably less bubbles and less problems in that way. So whenever the compiler or other programs can, they will try to reorder things. So they try to be smart.
Same.
Yeah, but if you imagine that we're doing it like this, and you would have 2 cores, or you would have 2 threads, or you would have hyper-threading or whatever's happening, or even 2 applications that are using the same memory address.
Yeah, so what happens if I'm running OBS and then playing a game and they want to use the same memory address?
Yeah, usually what the operating system will do is, when a program is running, it will be given a big slice of memory, and no other program can touch that memory.
You're not allowed to go outside of this area.
Exactly.
You stay here.
Yeah. But if you have one application, let's say a video game, and you have multiple threads, which all of them do now, and you have 2 threads of execution, which you can kind of think of as 2 programs that are running at the same time, and both of them want to ask what is the location of the player, and both of them want to update the location of the player, which you shouldn't be doing. There's only be one thing that does that, but let's say that 2 of them do that. They could write over each other, because you can imagine that one of them loads the number into A, then the other one, let's say it's not 200, it's 100 in this case. So we load the number 20 into A, then B also loads the number 20 into A increments it by 1, B increments it by 2, A stores it, and then B stores it. And now we've lost the work that A did. So that's why when you do multi-threading or programming that is asynchronous, it's called, you do locks, which is kind of putting in the blank space there between, you're putting a guard that says no. First this one executes, and then the other one executes. So that's called a mutex. That will kind of guard things between. So if you have 2 cores, you could put one of the load operations into one of the cores and the other one at the other core because they're independent. So these could be 2 threads, 2 applications, whatever. And then you would benefit from one of the cores doing one of the work and the other core doing the other work. And you would have less problems with bubbling. I mean, it might still happen, but you might have less problems with it. And that's also what hyperthreading, the idea with hyperthreading was doing is trying to reduce the bubbles by figuring out like, oh, there's going to be a bubble here or there is space. Let's run another application in that bubble space. You can think of it that way. It's not 2 cores, but from the outside it looks like 2 cores. But it's because of this bubbling that's happening or that you're not fully utilizing one CPU, it's thought of as 2 logical CPUs, even though it's one physical CPU.
So then maybe to go off a little bit of a tangent, when you look up a processor that you want to buy, it usually says like, it has 8 cores, but 16 logical CPUs, or cores, I guess. What is the actual physical component of creating hyperthreading? Like this, it looks like it's just doubled its cores, basically, right?
Well, that's, I mean, how you actually implement that is probably very, very complicated.
Magical.
It's magical, let's say that. But you can think of the general idea that even though there's one physical CPU,
it's basically just figured out a way for it to optimize its behavior to pretend like there's 2 CPUs?
Yes.
Or 2 cores?
Yeah, because you then run 2 applications on it, and in the gaps, in the spaces that one of them creates, you run the other one.
So basically, CPUs that aren't hyper-threaded just don't have this logic built into them?
Yeah, but they might do other tricks to reduce the bubbling.
Okay.
So a lot of the CPUs, like hyper-threading is Intel and AMD and other manufacturers, they're like, no, we have other techniques. So it's just one of the ways you can do to reduce, because what you want is, you want this grid to be as packed as you can. Yeah. Or as some of them say, you want all the transistors to be red hot. That's the idea.
They're really, really small, but they're really red and hot.
They're red hot, yeah. So yeah, you can run these 2 applications or 2 bits of code on 2 different cores. So then to end this speed, so we've talked about speed, but we haven't talked about CPU cycles or what's the speed, like,
because you said 5 cycles before.
Yeah, but I haven't mentioned like megahertz or gigahertz or whatever, because that idea kind of doesn't matter in this sense. It's just going to be higher is faster. And if a processor has higher, it can do those cycles faster. It doesn't always mean that it's better, but usually it means like you can do more. And it can matter in CPUs, like a CPU might have slower instructions or a thing that takes a longer time. But then let's play around with numbers.
I like numbers.
Good. So if I have a 4 gigahertz CPU, then one cycle is 0.25 nanoseconds.
Nanoseconds is?
Very small.
Very small, okay.
You'll see in a bit how small it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very small, we got it.
It is.
It's 0.25 very smalls.
It's a fraction of a very small.
Okay.
Yeah. So, fetching from L3 cache then is 38 nanoseconds.
And L3 cache is it the closest one to the CPU?
No.
Okay, that's the
furthest one.
Furthest one in the CPU.
L1 and registers are like a couple of nanoseconds.
Yeah.
Again, like I went through all sorts of PDF documentation and Intel specs to try to find like nice numbers. There is another graph online that does a similar thing, but it was from like a few years ago, so I wanted a more
up to date one.
An hour. So fetch from L3, it's about 38 nanoseconds. And of course, these numbers are going to vary a whole bunch. Like some of them were like from L3, one of the graphs said like, oh, it's from 20 to 100. So I found some other number, but anyway, this is more for fun, education. Just to
teach me.
Yeah, to give you the feel of how fast this is. So fetching from RAM is 0.1 microseconds.
Okay.
We're not even...
I didn't actually know the symbol for micro, so I saw that symbol, I was like, I don't
that
know
is
what
micro.
that is. Okay, now I know.
Yeah, so you have nano, and then micro, and then you have milliseconds.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we're in
And we're used to talking about milliseconds for like, at least when you're playing games like latency online. Like I have 50 milliseconds, and usually you can feel it around like 100.
Exactly.
Which is still very, very little.
Very little.
But
because 1,000 milliseconds is 1 second.
Yeah.
A million microseconds is a second, and a billion nanoseconds is a second.
Okay.
Yes, that's why it's 0.25.
So we are not feeling 0.25 nanoseconds.
Absolutely
anyway.
not. Absolutely
we cannot
not.
perceive this.
No, and even 5 of them.
Yeah.
For one instruction.
Yeah.
So 60 FPS is 16 milliseconds. So to draw one frame to keep 60 FPS, you have 16 milliseconds to do work. So you have quite a few CPU cycles until you hit 16 milliseconds. But again, like you talked about,
quite a few. Like
quite a few.
We have a couple billion, right?
Yeah. So to get a feel for this, let's scale it up.
Okay.
Let's say that one CPU cycle takes 1 second.
Okay.
It takes 1 second to do a cycle. That means that it takes 2 minutes and 32 seconds to fetch from L3. That's quite a while.
Yeah.
This video has been going on for 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Because fetching from RAM takes 6 minutes and 40 seconds.
Yeah.
Again,
we would have only been able to get a few things from RAM at this point.
Yeah, we would have been fetching like 2 things, 3 things from RAM at this point.
I feel like we're going to be here for quite a while to get 60 FPS.
Yes, because then 60 FPS is 2 years, a week, 3 days, 17 hours, 46 minutes, and 39 seconds.
That's some slow frames.
Imagine you get a frame every 2 years. But that gives you kind of at least some frame of reference of how short the time span is for CPU cycles. So there is a lot that happens, and both programmers and compiler writers and CPU architects and all that are trying to pack things as close as they could together and trying to do as little waste work, like work that you don't actually need and features you don't need, just so that we can do more within those 60 milliseconds.
I was just trying to like frame this in my head, like imagining trying to do like the reason you don't notice 0.25 nanoseconds is also if you think on the scale of 2 years, 1 week, 3 days.
Yeah.
You're not going to remember every second that happened in those 2 years.
Absolutely not.
And you probably won't even you can't go think back in your head and realize I remember that second.
Yeah, no.
Oh, that second happened.
That's not going to happen.
There's a lot of seconds that have happened now.
Yeah, that we're not going to remember. And
I remember every second when I'm with you.
That's sweet. And this is for 1 core. If you have 8 cores or 16 cores or whatever, and then if you could spread the workload out onto those cores.
Is this just 1 core?
Yes, this is 1 core. So if you have 8 or 4 or 16 or whatever you have, and then some of that work can be then packed and sent to the graphics card, which is just another type of a CPU. And it's a very specialized CPU. It has a much fewer instructions than a regular CPU, but it's more specialized. It really loves floating point numbers, while a regular CPU has support for it, but it really loves integers, like whole numbers. So, yeah, for a absolutely packed CPU, you want this kind of framework.
Nice.
Nice.
My brain is melted.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
We're going into something. We have one more part of the CPU section of this whole learning adventure.
Yeah, there's 1 episode left. I'm going there to touch on some of the modern elements that people think about, like a lot of the more on-the-box features that people talk about. It's going to be more higher level, but at least can give you some idea on that, and it will still build upon this. And then
now we're on to a new subject.
New subject. Go even further beyond FPS.
Let's do it. Thank you for being smart.
I try.
And we'll see you next time.
Bye.